before this committee on many occasions in the past. I am the president of Kansas Industrial Consumers and also president of Kansans for Lower Electric Rates. First of all, I want to thank this committee. This committee has done more for ratepayers in the last 4 years than any other entity in the state of Kansas. I'm deeply, deeply indebted and have deep gratitude to this committee. It really took the issue of competitive rates and economic development in the state and in the last 4 years gave it attention that is wonderful, and we're on our way, but we still have more work to do. So for my presentation, I would like to follow the handout that I gave so that I can move smartly through this and leave time for Adam Barron, who will follow me. Okay. The first page really tells the story. Kansas energy problem, high electric rates rising higher. When we turn to page 2, this gets into what the committee has done for us in the past and how we got to this point through the work of the committee. The committee had what originally was called Senate Bill 69, which became KSA 66-1287. And it had as its purpose really 2 items. Number one, the legislature commissioned 2 studies so that we could have a third-party look at how competitive our rates were within the state. And number 2, and most importantly, the committee said as state policy that Kansas should have regionally competitive electric rates and reliable service. So the policy was enshrined by the committee, and we were on our way. We did get the studies, as are indicated here. London Economics presented the first study. The second study was by AECON. And then we had additional studies. So this issue of Kansas competitiveness and electric rates or lack thereof has been studied by various third-party independents, including London Economics, AECOM, Evergy's internal analysis, and outside sources such as the Edison Electric Institute. Every single one of those examinations show that Kansas does not have regionally competitive electric rates, that we're in fact the highest in the region. This problem plays out within our state in this fashion. Evergy provides about 75% of the electric energy to the state, but it has a very extensive transmission system, which is used by most of the remaining 25%. That would include the electric co-ops, that would include municipals throughout the state. So the ascent of rates of Evergy through the years has had a pancaking effect through the state. Not only those who are directly retail customers, but also those customers that use the transmission system. So if we could turn to page 3, these are 2 of the studies that kind of show where we are. The first on the left is a rate example, and that's simply just presenting in graphic form the rate analysis of the United States Energy Information Administration. That is the third-party data that's used by pretty much anyone who looks at rate comparisons through the United States. The second graph to your right is the Global Energy Institute is the enterprise of the United States Chamber of Commerce. And they do an analysis of each state and where they compare to the remaining states each year. And they also use the U.S. Energy Information Administration data. So as you can see, if you look at Kansas, Kansas on the right graph lines up to Kansas on the left. One of the issues that we struggle with, of course, is those states which are our neighbors. This is a competitive world we live in, so we want to be competitive in all areas, really, in keeping business here and attracting business. And you can see that Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Iowa, and Nebraska, and Missouri, all our regional neighbors have lower electric rates. So if you would turn to page 4 of the graph, this is a graph that basically plots the cost of living increase as compared to the increase in retail electric utility rates. And one thing I want to mention here, on the right, if you see in the right-hand corner the federal tax cuts and the state tax cuts in that rate, I want to speak to that and first of all, give you a little definition to that. That is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was enacted by the Congress on December 31 of 2017. And since rates include a formula component, which is the corporate income tax rate, when the Congress reduced the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21%, that resulted in reduction in retail ratepayer rates for Evergy customers of $104 million per year. That's the difference between the formula rate at 21% and the formula rate at 35%. I want to mention another item and again express my gratitude to this committee. This committee granted us, as retail ratepayers, a rate reduction. House Bill 2585 was the bill that eliminated the state corporate income tax for utility companies. And that corporate income tax is 7%. And again, it was part of the formula workup. And when this committee spearheaded the reduction of that, or elimination of that corporate income tax for utilities, that resulted in an annual rate reduction for retail electric ratepayers in Kansas of $30.2 million. And I want to express my gratitude to the committee for that. That was a wonderful, wonderful reduction for us. And when you add together the federal and the state tax reductions and how it rolls through the rates, effectively, it reduced Kansas rates annually for Evergy customers by $134.3 million. That's a very big reduction, and it's all related to the work of this committee and this state, as well as the Congress and the reduction in the federal income tax rate. If we could please turn to slide 5. Slide 5 shows that slide 5 shows and plots the difference between volumes of electricity sold and investment in utility property. And as you can see, the investment line is trending very sharply upward, more investments, and the volume line basically stays the same. Now, I would not say that that's Evergy's fault or any utility's fault. There are a lot of things that work in the country that are pushing down electric rates. On the residential side, we have turnback thermostats, we have better windows, we have better siding, we have all kinds of things, and the trend for residential use of electricity is irretrievably downward. In 2020, which we'll call the year of the pandemic, Evergy had about 4.5% reduction in their volume, but that is actually pretty good for utilities throughout the United States. And what's interesting is the largest reduction is the commercial use of electric energy. You can go anywhere in Overland Park and Lenexa and Shawnee and see strip malls with half the stores vacant. I mean, the commercial use for electric energy is plummeting. The industrials, the people that I generally represent, stayed about the same. You know, we've hung in there during the pandemic year. And what won't surprise you, but certainly is the case, is that the residential use increased. And residential use increased because there are so many people working from home. In my office building, which those of you from Johnson County would know, it's basically the second building west of the Overland Park Marriott. We have Commerce Plaza 2. 50% of our building is not occupied. People left in March and have simply not returned. And I think you're seeing that all over the state and all over the United States, actually. But I want to mention one thing here about this investment. And this is a quote from the Kansas Corporation Commission's press release of June 16. They say, KCC staff and Evergy studies point to extensive capital expense investments and reduced sales as major drivers of the increase in Evergy's rates. That should come as a surprise to no one. No party would invest hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in investment without seeking a return. And when you see that line plotted in that fashion, that is 100% guaranteed to increase retail electric rates. That's the economic model that we have in Kansas and in many states. The more you invest, the more shareholder return. In many instances, it's a broken system because it doesn't relate to anything that's really tangible to what's going on in an electric system. I'd like you to please turn with me to page 6. And what I tried to do on page 6, this is again information from the Energy Information Administration of the federal government. And I tried to set out here, because all of my life as a lawyer is spent on economic development, trying to make it reasonable and helpful for businesses to stay in Kansas, to grow their employee base in Kansas, to grow their business in Kansas. And what I have found is that when you look around the United States, a lot of the incentives that are offered by the states are really pretty similar when you get down to it. And what you have here is a comparison of a foundational item, which is electric energy. And what it shows is the comparison of the rates from our two utilities, Evergy Kansas Central, which would be Wichita, Topeka, Lawrence, Manhattan, Salina. I think I have a list here. Wichita, Salina, Leavenworth, Manhattan, Lawrence, Topeka, Atchison, Hutchinson, and Pittsburgh would be major communities. And Evergy Kansas Metro would basically be Johnson County. It'd be Paola plus Lenexa, Shawnee, those areas. And so you can see the number of customers, you can see the rates, and you can see the comparison. And what I tried to do on this was to identify those states which are our direct neighbors, Oklahoma, Missouri, Colorado, Nebraska, and also two areas that are competitors for us. If you look at the last one, for instance, Mid-America Energy, Des Moines. Des Moines is the same distance from Overland Park as it is to Wichita as a reference point. So they're definitely a competitor of us, and Des Moines is halfway to Minneapolis. So, and Little Rock is an area that has had some growth. But as you can see, when a new business would come to Kansas and consider locating here or expanding a business, one of the things that they're going to see is that our rates are not competitive regionally. Having said that, that is what this committee did for our state. This committee said, we're going to have a state policy. We're not going to look backward. We're going to look forward. And so what we had was a progression of attention from this committee to the issue. In 2018, there was Senate Resolution 1612, which was really the beginning of noting that regional competitive rates are important. In 2019, we had, which later became KSA 66-1287, this committee set our state policy to provide information that may assist future legislative and regulatory efforts to craft forward-looking electric policy that leads to regionally competitive rates and reliable electric service. So the legislature, and particularly this committee, really set our course. They said they had Senate Bill 69, which was to independently verify the fact that we don't have regionally competitive electric rates. And the Senate committee also said, we can't look backwards, we've got to look forwards. So we need to establish a forward-looking state policy that will deal with this issue so that we can be competitive in the future and so that we can compete for new jobs and retaining employees and companies. The other item on number 7 that I want to relate to is the item that I mentioned to you before, and that's House Bill 2585. We had a report to this committee from, at that time, it was, I believe, Senate Budget Director Campbell, who reported and said that in the 5 years prior to House Bill 2585, no utility had paid any state corporate income tax. So it was not a deduction from the state treasury to give that relief to ratepayers. That is not to say that the utilities did anything incorrect. It's a capital-intensive business, so there's a lot of depreciation that's thrown off, and you would not expect capital businesses to pay a lot of income tax. It could be a car manufacturer, it could be a steel manufacturer, and so forth. But what you did for the ratepayers throughout the state is say, okay, if they're not paying any tax, if we're not receiving any revenue in the state treasury, why don't we take care of the ratepayers? So that is what happened, and that is the $30 million of rate relief that this committee gave to retail customers of Evergy throughout the state of Kansas. I want to note also on page 7, the bipartisan support. And I need to stop right here and again thank the committee. Senate Bill 69, which became KSA 66-1287, was actually crafted in conjunction with this committee. Senator Masterson was the chair of the committee at that time. Senator Peterson remains the vice chair of the committee. And much of the drafting of this bill was done under the auspices of those two senators. Now, I was involved in that. Did I get everything I wanted in that bill? No. But what Senator Masterson and Senator Peterson did was require everybody to come together and have a consensus of how we could go forward as a state. And as you can see, the final result of that was a bill that passed the Senate by 38-1 and a bill that passed the House by 117-7. And what that did through the auspices of this committee was to set in place the regulatory policy of a forward-looking policy for regionally competitive electric rates and reliable service. If we could turn to slide 8, please. There was 3 items that came out of that study which really told us we were on the right path. This is a study by London Economics, and as in all things, balance is important, and they note that the current IOU rate-making practices reflect some degree of imbalance between utility incentives and public interest objectives, such as achieving regionally competitive rates or other policy objectives. So what that says is we need to fine-tune that and get the balance back to the center where those things are in balance. Secondly, they highlighted the fact that we had underutilized assets and that is causing the rates to be at a higher level than they otherwise would be. And I had a brief discussion with Senator Francisco before the meeting started, and one of the ways you address this issue is a securitization bill that is fair to everyone involved and that has as its centerpiece the protection at the highest level for ratepayer interests. And the original bill was, in our opinion, at KIC and Clear, not to that level. But what we did was to work as a group. I think everyone would say we worked constructively among Evergy, the KCC staff, CURB, KIC, and others to craft this bill, which finally was a consensus bill that people felt that they could support because of the strong ratepayer protections. And then the third item is surcharges, and I'm going to get to that in the next pages, but surcharges, if you look at our bills in Kansas, our retail electric bills, surcharges make up about half the bill. It ranges from everything to environmental remediation, to transmission investment, to property tax, to all of these things that occur. And basically what the analysis is saying was that we need to get back to base rates and not have all these add-on tack-ons, which no one particularly understands anyway. If I could turn to page 9, this is where I want to really emphasize my presentation. If you remember, the centerpiece of Senate Bill 69, KSA 66-1287, is that the legislature, and particularly the KCC, would craft forward-looking policies that would allow us to implement the state policy of regionally competitive electric rates and reliable service. The KCC is particularly well equipped to handle that. Each of the commissioners is highly experienced, very fine people. The professional staff's highly experienced and very fine people. So I would not have any criticism for them other than we need to all be on the same page. This is a policy initiative of the state, and we need to have the KCC embrace that policy because of their great expertise and because of their experience, so that it can implement the legislative policy. I wrote 2 op-eds, which were published in the Kansas Reflector and also the Wichita Eagle, where I requested that the KCC more fully embrace this and to help really the retail ratepayers for a reason that I will get to in a moment. But I did want to mention that in these proceedings we've had at the KCC, which have been basically informational and informative, one of the bright spots has been Commissioner Duffy of the KCC has made numerous comments emphasizing to everyone involved the importance that electric rates be moderated to the extent that they can be. Okay. Let me move on to slide 10. And this basically speaks to the item that we talked about earlier. When the merger between Great Plains, which is KCPL, and Westar took place, there were rate moratoriums entered into, but those were base rates. They were not anything to do with the surcharges. And this gives you the increase in the transmission delivery charges in Evergy, Kansas Central for the 4 years, 18, 19, 20, and 21. And let me put some perspective to this for you. This TDC annual rate increase, everything considered over the 4 years, is a rate increase of $65.3 million to those Kansas towns that receive service from Evergy, Kansas Central. Let me put a little more perspective to that if I could. The April 1, 2021, $38 million increase, that's going to be $1 million a year increase to several of my clients. It is not an insignificant amount of money. If I could turn to page 11, I want to get to what is our main problem and where the system is probably broken in Kansas. And that is utilities make money by spending money. It's capital investment. And capital investment, they get a return on that. Property tax is paid on that. There is a recurring earning stream because those capital investments are in your rates for 30 years. The average depreciation life schedule for Evergy is, I think, 33 years, if I remember right. So once you put these into place, they're with you for the next 33 years. One of the things I did want to mention, too, is that I don't think anyone could say that we're being miserly in terms of capital expenditures, because in the case of Evergy, in their annual report at page 74, they have depreciation each year of about $880 million. That's a lot of money. The issue and where our rate increases occur is that they're spending about $1.8 billion. So the capital spending is, in the 5-year period each year, about $1 billion more than depreciation. If you turn to page 12, you can see how this CapEx plays out. In May of 2018, Evergy had a 6.0 capital expenditure program for the next 5 years. That was one of the basis for approving the merger, because at that level, you can kind of keep a lid on rate increases with the depreciation. But what happened after that, you can see on March 2 of 2020, it increased to 7.6. On August 5, it increased to 8.9. On February 28, it goes to 9.2. So what you have is an increase in that period of less than 2 years of an additional 53% increase in the CapEx. And of course, all of that will be included in retail electric rates throughout the state. No one invests $9 billion without an expectation of getting a return. If you turn to page 13, this is kind of where we're getting at, and there's no question that spending money is good for shareholder return. There is a question, however, whether spending that amount of money is good for retail electric rates. The issue that we have is we're starting out at a high level. You saw my charts, we're already highest in the region. And you add this kind of capital spending to it, there's no way to go, but rates will increase. Now, I want to pause for a moment and say this. That is not to say that Evergy, the items that Evergy wishes to spend money on or elects to spend money on a capital expenditure are not items that they should not spend money on. I'm sure there are lots of items that they would like to do. Our difference of opinion is most of those items, there's no priority to them. And what we talk about is how do you pace out an investment so that you don't just drive the rates to the ceiling? How do you take what would be a good investment and stretch it so there isn't this kind of dramatic impact on the retail electric rates for Kansas? Now, I want to get over to page 14, which is where this builds up to. If you see that the Wichita Eagle published a story which was correct in every respect. They said that the STP is expected to increase rates 10 to 12% in Wichita and the other 10 cities that I just mentioned to you. That 10 to 12% equates to over $200 million a year. And the way you calculate that, of course, is you look at the annual report of Evergy, which is page 55. And in 2019, they had $1.925 billion of revenue. And in 2020, they had $1.864 billion of revenue, which is the pandemic year. So you can basically talk about $2 billion to which this increase will be applied. Now, let me give you a little more definition that I alluded to earlier, and that is who's going to actually pay for this, right? Well, you have to look at where the customers fall out in this group. Residential customers of Evergy are about 43%. So 43% of that $200 million is going to be to the residential users in each of your communities where you represent. About 35% is commercial users, and about 21% is industrial users. So that's kind of how the breakdown of who's going to pay that additional matter. And one thing that my clients tell me is, Jim, don't ever talk about a $200 million rate increase. It's a $200 million rate increase that lasts 30 years. So what they say is, once you get this into rates, it's not $200 million, it's $2 billion over 10 years. And that is a correct way to look at it. You're not going to take poles and wires and substations out. They're going to be there for whatever useful time there is for those. So I want to get back down to the last page, page 15. And that is, we have the highest rates in the region. There's no question about that. The legislature has helped us every way that they can. This committee has been wonderful to us. Senate Bill 69, HB 2585 actually started here and then was combined into another House bill for passage. But we need more help. I don't think any of you, at least I do not believe anyone wants to go back to your communities, whether it be Salina or Lawrence or Manhattan or Wichita or Leavenworth, and say, you know, we knew there was a $200 million rate increase coming your way per year, and neither the legislature or the Kansas Corporation Commission took any action to either ameliorate that, to moderate it, to stretch it out. to do something that would balance the needs of retail electric ratepayers to those needs of the utility to have a reasonable shareholder income. Where this has all fell down and where we're not on the same page is this. Senate Bill 69 was passed and enacted by the governor on April 18 of 2019. We're 2 years on to that, and we don't have a framework as to how we're going to deal with these rates. I appreciate your time. I do not want to be ungracious to those who follow me, so I will at this time conclude that I would certainly be available to answer any questions either here or any other place that the committee might have. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be before this committee.
Thank you, Jim. We do have a second presentation from Adam Barron, and want to leave time for him to speak, and then we'll see at the end if we have time for questions. Adam, it's up to you, sir.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Senators, for this opportunity to speak to you today about electricity rates in Kansas. Jim had 15 slides and took a half hour. I've got 28 slides in a half hour, so I'm going to have to go a little bit faster than he did. So I might even summarize some of these pages without going into too much detail. But I did have a lot to cover today, and since it's your last day of school, I guess I better throw as much in as possible. I wanted to talk about the vortex experience. You know, that was a huge deal just a month ago. Maybe we've already forgotten about it, but it was a huge deal, trying to understand what happened. So that's going to take me 9 slides. Then I kind of want to review a little bit of what Jim just went through, where we are with electric rates, and that'll go pretty quickly, and how we got there, and hopefully that'll go pretty quickly. And then where do we go from here? That might also take me a little bit to explain, but my recommendations, you know, what might be avenues that we can pursue. I don't think anybody has any of the answers. I think we all sort of want to make a difference, or else we wouldn't be talking about this. I think everybody is trying to do their best, like Jim says, but everybody's also a little bit to blame for how we got here. So how do we kind of put the personalities aside, put you know, sore feelings or whatever aside? You know, I'm a business person. Like, how do we get to the bottom line? I think that's what we all need to kind of focus on over the next period of time, because we do have a problem. We all recognize it, and so what do we do about it? So the vortex experience, and I should just go back and say, I am by no means an expert in electricity. I just have been dealing with it, you know, as an owner of a business in Kansas for 30 years, trying to, you know, as an oil operator, it's our kind of our #1 expense. So how do we deal with it? I've been, you know, dealing with the utilities and trying to explain the problem. So as an oil operator and representing the oil community, it's a huge issue for us. It's a huge issue for our state. You know, like Jim was saying, these rate increases, they're going to go right to the bottom line of all of your constituents. So it's an issue for all Kansans, and it's an issue just for our state in general. You know, we all want to make our state better. There are lots of issues to address. This is certainly one of them. The area I'm going to focus on is sort of western Kansas. Jim is more the expert with Evergy. So for us, it's the Sunflower Co-ops, it's the KEPCO Co-ops, and it's Midwest Energy. So there's 26 kind of utilities that I'm going to more or less be talking about. Our experience, if I could just sort of boil it down, we've never had to do this before. We basically shut down our whole company during the vortex because we couldn't be guaranteed by the utilities that we would have electricity. So it wasn't so much that it was so cold out. It was that if we had to shut down, then the utilities were going to turn us back on. All of our lines would be frozen, and then we'd have spills. So we just took the decision, you know, we needed to conserve energy anyway. We didn't know when our wells were going to be shut down anyway, so we just shut down all of our production. And I think most of our industry did that. It was sort of once in a lifetime for us as well that we had to do such a thing. Actually, in the cities, like the city of Russell, they have kind of their own, the municipalities, you know, they operate kind of differently than the co-ops do. We actually didn't shut down our wells in Russell because they have kind of some backup generation. They sort of wheel power from maybe from different sources. I don't know exactly about how the city of Russell does their business, but we didn't shut down our wells in Russell because they didn't say we were going to have to be shut down. And the utilities, I don't think they knew when they were going to shut us down, so there wasn't kind of a lot of back and forth with us on kind of what we needed to do, which may have been helpful, because we could have indicated to them, yeah, we'll shut down our wells, and maybe that would have been a signal to them that they could have cut some other power on. But anyway, we shut down a lot of our wells. We didn't shut down our gas wells, by the way. Everybody thought, well, there was no gas. We didn't shut down our gas wells. The only ones we actually shut down were the ones that ran with electricity. The ones where we didn't need electricity, they kept running. You know, we've had cold weather before. In fact, all of our wells in Wyoming and Montana, they kept running during this period. So it was more kind of a different issue than necessarily cold weather. So we were down probably 2 to 10 days, and then we're still kind of putting a few wells back on, spending money. It was kind of unfortunate, you know, just coming out of the whole pandemic, and then all of a sudden this happened. And I would say, you know, we didn't realize our gas wells, they didn't get this $300 that you're talking about. We got $2. So the gas producers, we were kind of in the same boat as what ended up happening with some of these utilities that ended up kind of scrambling for gas at the last minute. So I would say those are the main things that I wanted to address. You know, this will be a cynical comment on my part, so just take it with a grain of salt. You know, when we were down with the pandemic, or our wells were down, you know, we didn't get compensated for lack of revenue from our wells. And the utilities, you know, they get compensated, you know, for everything, even though they didn't deliver service to us. So maybe there's a reporter in here who will quote something like that, but that's sort of the predicament we're in. The utilities are not businesses. They're more kind of like nonprofits, so they just kind of, you know, it's a different model. So, yeah, I definitely recommend that you look more into the vortex. And so let's try to understand what happened. I think it will be interesting for you if there's some commission that can be put together to look further into this, because it's not obvious what happened. There's a lot of sort of stories out there, but what actually did happen, as you know, gas is plentiful in our country right now. We have more gas than we know what to do with. We're exporting gas right now. So it's not like gas wells or gas production in America is all of a sudden running out. So that wasn't really, you know, the issue, and certainly something that we can remember for the next time. The Southwest Power Pool, you know, we're part of the Southwest Power Pool. We have so much capacity in the Southwest Power Pool. That's what this B2 slide says here. We have, even without wind and solar, we have so much excess capacity. So, you know, where was that capacity? And the winter peak, you know, this is sort of a misnomer. We had all this demand, you know, and that was the problem. If you look down kind of that last bullet point, really the demand was not too terribly higher than another peak period that we had before. So yeah, there was some more demand, but it wasn't beyond peaks we've had in the past. So just a little information for you there. The Southwest Power Pool has excess capacity, and B3 Kansas, we have a lot of excess capacity. You know, so you're scratching your head, where was that energy when we needed it? In fact, that 8,677 megawatts, that's almost not too less than what the peak responsibility is. And the KCC does this report twice a year that this data is coming from. So we have a lot of excess capacity in our state, but somehow it just wasn't there when we needed it. You know, sunflower's not kind of part of the whole Evergy system. They have excess capacity, and actually they're kind of growing their excess capacity as the demand goes down in their territory. And I think another interesting thing for me to point out to you, which Jim alluded to earlier, sunflower doesn't really run its plant very often now. Like you can see in the green here, they're generating for the demand in their area, you know, what is that? Almost 2.5, 3 times less than what they're buying in the open market, which I think is interesting. Maybe not everybody knows that. So that's another interesting statistic. On B6, you know, gas and coal kind of came to the rescue when wind and solar, you know, were not able to generate any power. So that's what this is the graph of what happened in February. So yeah, what happened in the vortex, B7, the wind didn't blow. As we all know, the wind blades froze, so there was no wind energy. The gas and coal plants sort of ramped up to save the day. I think what happened, and maybe this will be part of your investigation because this isn't information that's publicly available, those gas and coal plants, because they are deprioritized in the whole Southwest Power Pool, they probably didn't have their fixed price contracts in place. So they were scrambling when the Southwest Power Pool asked them to ramp up. And I think that's where you're hearing about, I don't know if you've heard these numbers, I think we're on the order of $250, $300 million that's going to be passed on to Kansas consumers as a function of this vortex. And a lot of that, they're blaming the gas industry. I don't know if that's the right way to position it. I think what happened was they were caught not with contracts in place to be able to then secure gas, at a fixed price. We have an ethanol plant, as an aside, an anecdote in Nebraska. We have a 25-year gas contract. We can never be without gas. So we have, gas prices are really low right now. So it was a good time for us to sort of lock in all of our gas prices because the Southwest Power Pool doesn't prioritize those baseload plants. I really just think this was a situation where they just got caught, with a once-in-a-lifetime thing. They didn't expect they'd have to be paying $200-$300 out there when they needed to run. So yeah, maybe the Southwest Power Pool is a little bit to blame in all of this, as well. I do think on B8 here that somebody should continue the investigation so something like this never happens again. And I think it'll also be interesting if you compare kind of what happened with Sunflower, what happened with Evergy, because Evergy, I think they're talking about $100 million kind of price tag in one of their areas, and they actually save money, I think, in another area is what I've come to understand. Sunflower had a $100 million kind of bogey that they're going to have to pass on to their consumers, but KEPCO didn't have $100 million. And Midwest didn't have a kind of $100 million problem. So what was kind of the difference? And why did Russell run, but the co-ops couldn't run? I think it'll be illustrative, what happened in the SPP. And one other point I'll make too is the gas. There was a problem of delivering gas to some of these gas plants. Well, they run on electricity too. So I think what happened was, and I've heard this from some people in the industry, is we didn't have electricity to run our plants because they weren't sort of prioritized in the emergency kind of hierarchy of what needed to run. And I think that exacerbated the problem as well. So you had gas pipelines that didn't have their compressor stations operating. You had gas plants that weren't running. So it all just kind of became something that could have been avoided. It's always easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. But I think as you look into this, you'll see that there was more to this story maybe than meets the eye. So I'm going to turn to C here, Kansas, and Jim did cover a lot of this. C1, Kansas, this is the problem we're all here to address, is paying $775 million more a year for electricity than we did in 2010. I guess now with this other $200 million that we're talking about, it could be $1 billion a year that we're paying, and that's just a tax on the Kansas consumer. C2, this is just straight out of this study from last year from London Economics. Our rates are the highest. A lot of it's C3, a lot of it's Evergy. In my house in Wichita, I'm paying 70% more for my electricity than I did 10 years ago. And then the next page, it's not just Evergy, it's also Western Kansas, residential customers in Western Kansas, and the co-ops, they're the second highest on that bar graph there to Colorado, 14 cents a kilowatt hour. And then commercial prices, this is where it affects the oil industry in Kansas, were the highest, rates in Kansas. So that is a problem, and so you're having wells prematurely plugged in Kansas that's hurting our economy because our electric rates are too high. As an example, in Oklahoma, which is probably the poster child for how you do manage an electricity grid and rates, we're paying 5, 6, 7 cents a kilowatt hour compared to numbers here of 13, 14 cents. So it's just a huge, detriment to our state. This next page, where you can't read these numbers, just basically shows we've had one of the highest increases, in the country in the last 10 years in Kansas. C7, this was AECOM. Yes, we all know this. Electric rates do hurt, do hurt development of business and our economy. So, it doesn't have to be this way, and I think this is where you guys come in. How do we sort of go in a different direction? Because the Southwest Power Pool actually has among the lowest wholesale power prices in the country. You can see on page C8, 3.5 cents is the wholesale cost of power. In western Kansas, what I'm most familiar with, we're paying 6.5, 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that delta, is just all the difference in the world. In C9, I'll just kind of urge you to think about McPherson. For some reason, I don't know how they manage their business there through their Board of Public Utilities, but by gosh, look at their numbers. Their commercial rates, they're actually a little too high, so maybe if we had oil wells, I'd talk to them about that. But their residential rates and their industrial rates, they've grown their GDP, and I would think electricity has something to do with that. So, there's a little bit of a flicker there of opportunity that we could look into.
Mr. Chairman, can I say something? I mean, we're going over a lot of facts here, but we're not going to be able to dispute any of this because we're running out of time. I mean, McPherson is a municipality that's a small geographic area that is exempt from all kinds of taxes and regulations that Evergy isn't. I mean, and we're going to start drawing comparisons to McPherson versus a co-op in western Kansas where their customers sometimes are miles away. I just don't think it's fair that the committee don't have time to at least respond to some of these questions. I mean, I could go over each one of these and respond with tons of questions.
Understand. We have given Evergy time. We gave them an hour. We've given the other people an hour to present their information. And I think, given the fact that we're looking at different things across the state, these are just kind of facts for the entire committee to consider, but I thank you.
I mean, like Russell's got a gas turbine. I mean, we can go right down the list.
I understand, but I think we need to let Mr. Barron finish up. Thank you, Senator Olson.
So continuing on to D1, how did we get here? I would kind of throw out to you these 6 basic reasons. And, you might have other reasons, you might dispute these. So, by all means, we all have to find a way to get to lower electric rates in Kansas. Evergy, they're sort of the elephant in the room. The shareholder return model does incentivize more capital spending beyond what the SPP is requesting that they do. And the KCC is supposed to supervise them. Those are smart people over there. They do a great job. But somehow, it hasn't quite worked out, to the level where we're seeing kind of rates come down and where we're regionally competitive. I think the Southwest Power Pool, is part of the place to look for problems. The government's certainly a problem with, all the billions spent hooking up wind and solar farms, the Obama Clean Power Act. The Biden plan is looking for more and more kind of renewable opportunities. I just throw out there in Germany, they're paying 30 cents, a kilowatt hour for their electricity because they're basically, going all clean energy over there. And of course, the Southwest Power Pool, like I said, they kind of prioritize some of the wind and solar and deprioritize baseload plants, which didn't really work out well last month. And over the long run, it may not work out well either. It does lead to the fact where we've got these underutilized plants in Kansas, coal and gas plants, that end up having to overcharge to sort of make up to pay their debt and other expenses that they can't kind of recover because they're not running their plants at full speed. And this chart here from London Economics kind of points that out. Kansas, in their analysis, is running their coal plants 50% of the time. I think the co-op model does need to be looked into. They're very, good people in western Kansas. I'm not saying that, but I think it's the point where we have to look into everything. The co-ops, they're not regulated anymore by the KCC. And so, they used to have a place where you can kind of come in as a customer and object to a rate change, but now they kind of figured out the system. They're just not going to do rate changes. They're just going to kind of add on to special fees. So there's really no opportunity to look into the co-ops anymore. I've complained many times that as a customer, we can't run for their board anymore. So, because we don't live in their territories. They're not really market-based. They're more kind of nonprofits. So they're not really sort of gearing their business to try to kind of attract as much business and retain as much business as possible. And maybe we have too many co-ops in Kansas. I'm just throwing this out there because we should be looking at everything. The Kansas Legislature, yes, you've done great things, but maybe it's time to get a little bit more involved in what we need to do for Kansas. And yes, we don't have any real market economics at play. And and there's a slide that I include here in the past. We don't need Australia to tell us what to do, but in a report they did, market reforms is the only really high quality regulator. And I would subscribe to that also. And it's not even Australia. The London Economics in their study claim that deregulation does lead to lower costs. So it's not any novel concept in America that competition might be one way to address high electric rates. So E1, I do think it's time for a change. It's time to sort of maybe even think a little bit differently about this problem than we have in the past. This is a chart from London Economics. The next page of my recommendations sort of draw from. They kind of put arrows on here to indicate what they thought might be some of the ways to address getting us to regionally competitive rates. So you can kind of look at that yourself, the SPP, deregulation, more kind of involvement from the state. Those are kind of areas that they looked into. And, for me on E2, where do we go from here? This is, just generally speaking, I'm not offering any bills. It's not time to do that. This is your last day, anyway. But these are areas that I think, you probably already know, but I'm just going to repeat them. Evergy, again, we have to scrutinize carefully any proposed rate increase in whatever form it might come. So that's kind of what Jim was alluding to. And let's ask them for a plan. How are they going to lower electric rates in Kansas to get us regionally competitive? I think we need to have a more thorough review of the generation assets in Kansas. We've got all this capacity. Where was it during the vortex? Are these plants not really operational? They're just sort of on the books. Why aren't they operational, and how much would it cost to get them operational? And if we can get them operational, but we don't think we'll ever use them, well, what is the best thing to do with these underutilized plants? Do we decommission a whole bunch of them? Or do we kind of put in the money to make them ready? Or do we sell some of them? I don't know. And I don't think this is the time to build out new assets when we have so much capacity already. I think the London Economics study said that we have the most wind capacity of any state in the country compared to our energy usage. So yeah, and make sure the vortex doesn't happen again. I think you should review our participation in the Southwest Power Pool. Do we derive more benefit than cost now and in the long run being part of the SPP? Maybe we do. As a customer, I don't think I've derived the benefit from being part of that Southwest Power Pool in terms of lower costs. Maybe we have, but I think it's something to be looked into. I do think we should be looking into those rural utilities. What can be done? Maybe there's nothing that can be done, but when you look at a problem, from a business standpoint, you'll always find something. So maybe ask them, what would they do to attract and retain more customers? What would they do to lower rates? What are some of the impediments that they face that maybe we could all work together on to make a difference? Do we have too many utility territories? I'm sure they're not going to like that I said that, but when we have 27 utilities or whatever the number was, maybe that's too much because you have sort of an overhead associated with all of those, and our demand isn't going up, it's sort of going flat to down. Maybe we regulate the co-ops on some basis again. And then I do believe that it would be worthwhile for this committee and our state to look into the pros and cons of deregulation for some, maybe not all of our state, but for some part of our state. The problem with the vortex, Rob, was not deregulation. I'm sorry. You may have been told that, and you can object with me all you want, but you can read the Texas Railroad Commission commissioner wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which is attached here, which I encourage you to read, where it really was not a deregulation issue. We would need this power no matter what. We're not deregulated in Kansas, and we had problems with power. They're deregulated in Texas. They had problems with power. The issue was having too much wind, not enough baseload power readily available. This is America. Competition works, And I think it's something that should be looked into. Bring in the Texas Railroad Commissioner and ask him. I mean, they've gone through every mistake, probably that you could go through in an open market. Just bring him in here and talk to him and see what they have to say to you. They've had rates that have gone down over time, where we've had rates that have gone up over time. $230.
That's pretty good.
I fit in as much as I can.
Went through that pretty doggone
With
fast.
Rob not liking what I said, I even got through the report, but
I've got actually about 3 minutes for any questions for either Mr. Barron or Mr. Zakura, if any committee. Senator Olson.
I'm going to start with Mr. Zakura first because I want to talk about rates. You talked about commercial rates. We ought to look at reducing them. You represent a lot of people right now at the KCC. It's my understanding most of your customers are getting a large reduction, 30, 35, 40%. I've never, I'd like to know, is there any commercial users in this state that have a spatial agreement that has any reduction? You've been representing people to KCC. I mean, and if it does, I really believe that's causing my seniors have higher bills.
May I respond to that?
Yes. Make sure you identify yourself and make sure the mic's on, I think.
Is the microphone on?
Yeah, I think it is.
Let me respond to that directly.
Go ahead.
Carlson. There's about 5,000 industrial customers, and to the extent of my knowledge, there's 3 what you might call special contracts. Each of those special contracts had a co-applicant, that being Evergy. Evergy was the initiator of those contracts, and each of those contracts were reviewed by the KCC, and each of those contracts were endorsed by the Citizens Utility Ratepayer Board. They only speak, Senator, to base rates. Let me give you a couple of examples. Number one, Spirit Aerosystems has a special contract. It does not cover the transmission delivery charge. It does not cover any of the trade charges. There was an analysis made in that case by the KCC that it was appropriate for Spirit to have a reduction in the base rate only because they were looking at whether or not to maintain that business in Wichita or whether to do that business or increase that business in Tulsa or overseas. The second contract I would mention to you is the Occidental Chemical contract. Well, let me go back. There's been no decision made by the Corporation Commission as to whether any reduction that might be available to Spirit would be put on anyone else, whether it be a residential or anyone else. So that's number one. Number two is Occidental Petroleum. Occidental Petroleum does have a special contract. It's by far the largest user on the system, but it has a special contract for several reasons. Number one, it can go from about 115 megawatts to 0 usage in 10 minutes. Evergy thought that was valuable, so Evergy initiated that contract, and in the latest loss and not enough scarcity of capacity, Occidental went down. They shed entire load, 115 megawatts. Let me put that in perspective for you. That's a great benefit to the entire system, and it's a great benefit to Evergy. Giving some definition to that, my original hometown of Osawatomie uses about 5 megawatts for 5,000 people. So it's a very big deal when a customer can bring that kind of value to all the other customers on the system.
Well, we are now out of time, so we've got to be on the floor. But thank you both to Jim and to Adam for being here today and providing the information. Thank you, committee. Remember to take your folders, and we are adjourned.
I would say that I'm happy to continue